There we go. Alrighty. I see the Dr. Sumner's PowerPoint's up on the screen here, looking at my other screen. So why don't we get started? I want to welcome everyone to the December meeting of the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. This month we're doing it a Zoom meeting. We very much appreciate our guest coming to us from Massachusetts, of all places, and the great work she's doing up there. This month we have Dr. Judith Sumner, who's going to be speaking to us on the botany or the botanical history specifically of the American Civil War. Dr. Sumner has multiple books on botany and the history of botany, particularly two that relate to military history. Her first was the Botanical History of the Second World War, and her most recent one is the Botanical History of the American Civil War. So we're going to turn it over to our speaker this evening and jump right into it. But we do want to thank once again the National Museum of Civil War Medicine for facilitating this Zoom event and for live streaming it for us on their YouTube channel. So thank you to them, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. There should be comments available online. If you have any questions for Dr. Sumner at the end of the talk, please feel free to put them in the comments section on the YouTube channel, and we will try to address those as best we can. But Dr. Sumner, at your leisure.
Hello, everybody. This is Judith Sumner. It's true, I'm in Massachusetts, and I'm a botanist, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about my pandemic project, which was investigating any and all links I could find between the plant kingdom and the American Civil War. And the idea for this book actually stemmed, as Matt said, from a book I published in 2019, which was a botanical history of the Second World War. These are the first books that have been written on botanical military history that endeavor to look at any connections that can be discovered between the home front and or the military and the plant kingdom. And so I hope this talk sheds some light on some sort of just some new ideas of thinking about warfare from a botanical standpoint. And as I told Matt before we started, the father of ethnobotany is a botanist at Harvard named Dr. Richard Evan Schultes. And the late Dr. Schultes always commented that botanists should be allowed to be invited into the arena of history and asked to do some of the writing about history, because so often historical events, whether they're severe shortages or warfare or illness, something has a botanical component to it. And botanists can help to shed some light on some of these issues. So tonight I'm going to try to look at the American Civil War from the viewpoint of a botanist and tell you about some of the connections I found between the plant kingdom and this war. And so this slide shows you some of the topics that are in the book. And we'll talk about many of these tonight. We'll talk about, well, I'll show you in a bit the main topics that we'll discuss. But we'll look at it from both the viewpoint of the North and the South, but primarily the South, because the big changes and the big adaptations to life occurred in the Confederate States. This is something, by the way, that a number of reviewers of this book have pointed out, that I do look at the Civil War primarily from a Confederate viewpoint, and there's a reason for that. The big shortages, the embargoes, the real headaches, the real problems, the starvation, the medical issues were primarily Southern Confederate issues. And so that is where the real material was, and that is what I do investigate for the most part. So let's start off by talking a little bit about enslavement, the practice of slavery, because that is really what the Civil War was fought over. And of course, slavery occurred in all of the original colonies, including my home state of Massachusetts. Here we had the Body of Liberties that was enacted in 1641, the legal code of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Body of Liberties allowed human bondage, and for the next 130 years, Most colonial exports in some way depended upon enslaved labor for their production. Up here, slavery ended in the 1780s. The big difference is that in the North, enslaved people were skilled workers. They were carpenters, blacksmiths, printers, coopers. They built many of the ships that were involved in the triangle trade that you see illustrated here in this picture. The triangle trade involved the trading of rum for African slaves. Those slaves were needed to cultivate cane sugar for rum production. And then the profits were used to buy Caribbean sugar and molasses for the New England rum distilleries. And so you had this triangle that was operating until the 1780s. Contrast that to what was going on in the Confederate States, where enslaved people were primarily working in agriculture. And the ones who were not working in plantation agriculture were house slaves for the owners and planters of those plantations. The crops that were being raised in the South were not being raised for Southerners to eat. This was not subsistence farming. This was not subsistence agriculture. For the most part, they were luxury crops, crops that were not essential, for which there were totally viable alternatives. These luxury crops were raised on an immense scale using enslaved labor. Slaves cost money. They were a big investment. They were a valuable essential commodity in plantation agriculture. And it became somewhat of a vicious cycle that to do this type of large-scale agriculture, you needed slaves, and then slaves, the money to buy the slaves came from the large-scale agriculture. So it became more or less a vicious cycle. So these are the topics I'm going to look at tonight with you. First of all, that relationship between crops and enslavement and slavery. Then we'll zero in on plantation life and see what life was like for both enslaved people and members of the planter-owner class in plantations. Then we'll look at Civil War medicine, particularly the vexing problem of malaria. We'll talk a little bit about opium, and I'll talk a little bit about slave medicine. And then we'll take a look at landscapes in war, looking primarily at Confederate landscapes and how war affected those landscapes, and a bit on military engineering in those Southern landscapes. So here are the cash crops that were being grown on Southern plantations. One of the earliest ones was indigo. It's a legume. It's from Asia. Tobacco, which is from tropical America. It's in the same family as potatoes and tomatoes. It's the nightshade family. Rice, it's a grass, originally from Asia. Sugarcane, originally native to Papua New Guinea. A lot of the agricultural technology and the crystallization process for sugarcane was worked out in India. And cotton, lastly. There were actually two species of it that were grown. The sort of the typical cotton that we all know, and then an upland variety. And that was also a tropical plant. The limiting factors for all of these 5 cash crops were labor, land, and soil nutrients. To grow them on the scale at which they were being grown, and for the most part, they're very labor-intensive crops that also require some processing. You needed cheap or free labor. All of them, if they're grown intensively year after year on the same acreage, tend to use up the land, literally use all of the soil nutrients from the land. And so the original strategy was to just keep on clearing more and more land, which required enslaved labor to accomplish. And then there was the matter also of what are we going to do about replacing soil nutrients, and the whole invention of the idea of soil amendments, adding things to the soil. So we'll touch on all of those as we move through the talk tonight. So just to show you some pictures of what these crops are, indigo. There was actually also a species from tropical America that was grown, but this is the Original Indigofera tinctoria from Asia. It was planted by early colonists. It was the source of a stable blue dye for cloth. And there were slave cultivated indigo plantations in South Carolina. And by the way, if you've ever been to the South, and actually even some homes in the North have this, it's a common practice, a custom really, to paint the ceiling of your porch a pale blue color. That pale blue comes from indigo mixed in with whitewash, basically a water-based blue paint. And that's where that idea of the blue porch ceiling comes from. It was considered good luck, sort of a salutation to your visitors. And then we have tobacco. Now, we know tobacco today as an addictive vice. But if we go back to the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, tobacco was actually medicinal, and it was thought to cure plague. And so one of the reasons that it was cultivated and sold was as a potential curative for plague. That does not actually work. That was an idea that got started as early as the 1600s with some of the European herbalists. It's a particularly labor-intensive crop. The leaves have to be picked, they have to be strung up, they have to be cured, they have to be packaged. And so this required a lot of cheap labor. Rice, Asian grass that requires standing water. So this was immediately a hazardous crop because where you have standing water, you have the mosquito life cycle going on. And you have the female mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquitoes, trying to bite you and perhaps introduce malaria into your bloodstream. This actually was not known in the middle of the 19th century. It was known that there was something involving swamps and water that was causing malaria. We'll get more into what their theories were later, but slaves were often very well adapted to the rice paddies because as many as 40% of the Africans coming to this country were immune to malaria for a genetic reason, which we'll talk about later. And so having them working in the rice paddies, they could be kept malaria free. And this also was heavy, hard work because these paddies had to be flooded. And so there was a lot of earthworks that had to happen, and then going out there and planting all these little seedlings and keeping the land weed free and keeping the aquatic plants out of there, labor intensive. And then we come to sugarcane, originally known as a wild grass in Papua New Guinea, taken into cultivation. You crush the stems, out comes a juice. That juice can be concentrated. You get a supersaturated solution and you can get crystalline sugar. And then there's the waste product of molasses that also could be used at the table or used in making rum. The original introduction to Haiti was by Christopher Columbus. It was already an entrenched crop in the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean, it came to the southern US. There were plantations of sugar here by 1850. Hundreds of cultivated acres, as far north, by the way, as Maryland, but particularly in South Carolina and Georgia, and also to some extent in North Carolina. It was grown as a perennial, and it was harvested as many as 4 times before the fields had to be burned and replanted. And again, it was extremely labor intensive. And then the biggest of all of these crops, cotton. Cotton is a fiber. It is harvested from the capsules of a mallow relative. It's a relative of hibiscus, for instance. And the seeds form with hairs attached to the outside of the seed coat. And those hairs can be removed and spun into thread, and then that thread can be woven into cloth. And so that's what was going on here. 2 species, sort of the typical one, Gossypium hirsutum, and then there was an upland variety with longer fibers and it had a softer texture. I think a little bit better type of fabric could be made from it, and that was Gossypium barbadense. And the demand for cotton was extreme. It had so many possible uses. This shows you at a microscopic level what was actually going on here. Top right shows you what the cotton fibers look like under a scanning electron microscope. they come in two lengths. You've got the lints, which are longer than the linters, which are shorter. And the more high quality cotton has more of the longer fibers, the lints. And these fibers form, as I mentioned, on the seed coat, on the outside wall of the seed, and they cling tenaciously to the outside wall of the seed. And so you can see some of the brown seeds there at the bottom, and then what they look like when you pull them out of the boll, the B-O-L-L, that mass of hairs, and you just find the seed. It's a little hard particle, but they come out and they still have cotton fibers clinging to them. So that was a major limiting factor, how to efficiently clear those fibers from the seeds, or maybe I should say remove the seeds from the fibers so the fibers could be spun. Another huge limiting factor was what cotton over time does to soil. Cotton roots extend 4 to 6 feet down into the ground, and they extract every known soil nutrient of the necessary soil nutrients. So those would be N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And after a couple of years, the soil in which cotton is growing is completely devoid of those. Basically, they're the components of fertilizers, N, P, and K. If we go back to the early part of the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt in 1804 observed in his travels, during his travels in South America, that there were islands off the coast of South America loaded with bird dung. It became known as guano. The Incan Indians had used guano since ancient times to grow their crops. And Alexander von Humboldt brought guano back to Europe. It was analyzed chemically, found to have high levels of N, P, and K. Gee, that's just what cotton needs to grow. And guano turned into a huge industry. And you can see a couple of the advertisements there in the middle from agricultural journals and magazines. And there were many, many different companies that sprung up overnight to sell this stuff. It was expensive because it's heavy to move and it came from a distance, and it was being mined off the coast of South America and then transported by ship to North America. And all of the Farm Journal editors and correspondents debated the nutrient content of different types of guano, which bird species, which island. And of course, as you can imagine, there were all sorts of examples of somewhat fraudulent sales of guano, where the guano was stretched with sawdust or soil or anything else that was available. Guano was so expensive that your average everyday farmer really could not afford it. And they relied on what today we would call compost, wood ash from oak and hickory, soil, horse manure, decomposing leaves, what we used to be called leaf mold. But the big planters and the plantation owners, the growers of these cash crops, went to guano. And it was guano that allowed them to keep using the same land over and over rather than having to use enslaved labor to clear new land every couple of years. And so cotton became known as king cotton. And you can see some illustrations here. Top left actually is a Currier and Ives illustration from the Reconstruction era, 1870s, showing you how nicely everything was going. Where you have free men there cultivating the fields. You have members of the planter class in the foreground. We'll talk more about, I'll show you that illustration larger later, so we'll talk about that more then. You can see enslaved labor working. You can see a couple of industrial scenes there. Top right, lower left. That shows the cotton gin. Cotton gins at work. We'll mention those in a bit. Middle image on the bottom. That's the Lebrun portrait of Marie Antoinette. Notice the way she's dressed, and contrast her dress with the illustration to the right there from Godey's magazine. So most American women favored early in the 19th century, end of the 18th century, the more elaborate dressing styles advertised, advocated by Godey's Whereas some of those dresses actually required 15 yards of fabric. So a huge amount of fabric had to be purchased and used by the dressmaker to make a dress of that style. And compare that with the little gown there, the cotton muslin gown that Marie Antoinette is wearing in the Le Brun portrait. That gown style became known as the robe de Gaulle, basically a French robe, French gown, and it became a very popular style. And a tremendous amount of cotton that was grown by enslaved people on plantations went to make these types of women's clothing, particularly the robe de Gaulle. The Godi styles that you see there have cotton, or in some cases cotton and wool, in some cases cotton and linen. Calico was an inexpensive fabric that was all cotton. And so cotton was also the demand for cotton was also being driven by the fashion industry at the time. And now we want to say a little bit about the cotton gin. Gin is short for engine. And a major limiting factor with cotton production was getting those seeds out of the fiber so that the fibers could then be spun into thread, the thread woven into cloth. So everybody, we all took American history as students, as children, as high school students, and we learned about Eli Whitney. Uh, Eli Whitney actually was a virtual neighbor of ours here in Massachusetts. I live in the middle of the state, Worcester, and just to the east of where I live is the town of Westboro, and that's where Eli Whitney was from. But he became a tutor, and he was working on a plantation, tutoring, teaching, and he saw the struggles with having enslaved people sitting around picking these seeds out and how labor intensive and time consuming this was. And he got this idea of a mechanism that involved wire teeth and little screen-like grids so that the cotton fibers are being pulled by the wire teeth, and then the grids are allowing those seeds to fall through. And so you basically end up with fibers separate from seeds. And so he started with a little tabletop model, and these became bigger, and these became bigger, and then finally we had big mechanized cotton gins. The problem was, of course, at the time, patent law was ignored. It was virtually non-existent in a consistent way in the US. And so many other inventors or possible inventors came and looked at the Whitney cotton gin, tweaked one a little bit, maybe put a little different handle on it, or maybe a little bit different type of tooth, and then claimed a completely new patent. And so Eli Whitney did not get wealthy from his invention. But it was the cotton gin and guano working synergistically that really launched King Cotton as the major plantation crop. And then, of course, we have the seeds. And what became of all the seeds? So the seeds of cotton launched basically their own industry. The seeds could be crushed. They would release an oil. That oil could be put in oil lamps for illumination. It could be used to make soap. It was used to lubricate machinery and in treating cured leather. Then you have left behind what you see in the top right, and that is basically the remnants of the seed coats. And there was huge amounts of this stuff left over after the seeds were pressed, and that is seed cake, and that was fed to livestock. So basically no part of the cotton product went unused. Either the fibers were used or the seeds were used in some way. And all of this was going on with the knowledge of abolitionists, primarily in the North, who didn't like any of it. And the abolitionists tried to come up with alternate products to the two largest plantation crops. They advocated using flax fiber to weave linen cloth and use that in place of cotton cloth. And they advocated using sugar maple, harvesting the sap from sugar maple in the late winter boiling it down, crystallizing the sugar, and using that in place of sugar cane from Papua New Guinea. And this happened among abolitionists in the North, and much was written about it, and people were urged to do this. I will say the one issue here is that linen cloth is simply not as warm as cotton. Cotton has a fibrous nature to it. Linen does not. Linen is not fuzzy, is what it boils down to. And linen is a cold cloth, and it simply does not insulate as well as cotton. And so many people here in New England spent their winters freezing in linen cloth and would have been much warmer in cotton cloth. But on principle, were wearing linen because they were at their heart abolitionists. And now I will segue into plantation life and talk a little bit about some of the botanical aspects of life on Southern plantations, beginning with how the slaves lived. So slaves had their own dwellings. Top left, you can see a reconstruction of the earliest type of slave cabin in the Confederate States. And this is essentially a thatched roof hut that some of the first Africans who arrived in this country built for themselves on plantation land. These were quickly replaced. And we don't know whether it was the result of plantation owners not wanting something with African origins on their land, whether they thought the thatched roof was primitive, but very soon they began building wooden cabins for their enslaved workers. And you can see a little bit of the evolution of these cabins. Some of the early ones were log cabins with dirt floors, no stove, no heat. Over time, chimneys were added, fireplaces were added. In lieu of true masonry, mud was used to hold bricks or stones together, typically mud mixed with straw, so it was basically a wattle type of mixture. The favored wood for these cabins, that would be the most long-lasting wood, was bald cypress, and you can see those trees in the top right, native to southern swamps. And this, by the way, is the same wood that was favored for many caskets. The best caskets during the Civil War were made from bald cypress as well, because they did not decompose when buried in the soil. Many planters took great pride in the health and safety of their enslaved people. They added wood floors. In some cases, middle image in the bottom there, they made clapboard style cabins for them that mimicked the appearance of the big house on the plantation. Abolitionists traveling to the South complained bitterly about the conditions under which slaves were living, and some owners responded to that by improving housing conditions. But this was also a business decision, because if slaves were living in warm, comfortable conditions with a bed and a little bit of privacy, and families were kept together, you're going to have more slaves being born. And slave children were a valuable commodity because they could be sold. And so we'll talk a little bit about families and births later, but these cabins got better with the hope that more children would be born. Lower right, that little inset shows a Currier and Ives image of a group of slaves, enslaved people, fighting a fire in a slave cabin. That was one of the supposedly humorous images that Currier and Ives published in the Dark Town Comics, which was a series of crude illustrations of plantation life from the viewpoint of the enslaved person. We always think of Currier and Ives images from the 19th century as being very refined pictures of home life, landscapes, the way of life. But they had another side. And these Darktown comics were thought to be humorous. And they typically uh, showed hapless activity, foolishness, stupidity, lack of common sense. And that's what that little image down there shows. If you want to see more, you can find Google images of these. It's quite a different side, to Currier and Ives in the 19th century. Another type of structure that was extremely important to enslaved people is known alternately as the brush arbor or hush harbor. And you'll see both in the literature. So these were outdoor buildings or structures or hiding places made of botanical materials, patterned after the outdoor structures that many white Christians in the South made, particularly during the Southern months, for revival meetings and camp meetings, where they would cut down trees and rig up some sort of a simple roof and lay boughs over it and then have a camp meeting or a revival meeting, often at nighttime. Many enslaved people decided to do the same sort of thing, to have a place where they could go, speak African languages, sing songs that they remembered, share religion. There were many versions of religion being practiced that commingled remnants of African religion with Christianity. Some of the earliest of the brush arbors or hush harbors were made in cane brakes. So cane is a native grass that particularly grows on riverbeds in the South. There's honestly not that much of it left. Much of it has been cleared, but it's similar really in many ways to bamboo. And you can get the scale of it over there on the lower right. And you can see what it looks like cut down in the lower left. And you can either cut it down and use the branches, or sort of a simple solution to the problem was just to make a clearing in the middle of the cane brake and simply meet there. Now, why all this vegetation? Vegetation, when it's all leafed out, will stop noise from traveling. And so enslaved people at night could just steal away to these more or less secret locations and meet and sing and pray with a degree of privacy. And no one at the big house needed to know. Wanted to say a little bit about how all of this culture was regarded in popular culture. And I have to say something about Stephen Foster. So actually, Stephen Foster had not visited the American South until after he became well known as a songwriter commemorating the Southern way of life. But if you look at the lyrics of some of his songs, like My Old Kentucky Home, talks about the corn tops ripe and the meadows in the bloom, and the young folks roll all around the cabin floor. He's talking about slaves here. They're merry, all happy and bright. There's a theory that some of this was actually inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, where there's discussion of children in the cabin and having a childhood spent in these cabins. He has a song Down Among the Cane Brakes, which I think you can see in the upper right there, and the cane brake image below it, just to remind us. And so basically talks about how people were living in these cabins and what their way of life was. And it sounded pretty good. It sounded pretty pleasant. I don't think it was pleasant all the time. It might have been pleasant none of the time. But that is how this way of life was being portrayed in popular American culture. And then we come back also to Currier and Ives. So this is the picture that I said we'd look at, a little bit larger version of it. This is the title of it is A Cotton Plantation. A cotton plantation on the Mississippi. And it's from 1884. And what you see here are former enslaved people, freed men out there in a cotton field, picking cotton. And in the foreground, we have a well-dressed couple, very likely the planter, the owner, and his wife. And they're in dramatic contrast to the freedmen in the field. and it looks like everyone's getting along pretty well. I don't know if that's true. Uh, Back right rear, you can see some smoke coming out of a chimney. That would be an engine, a gin, cotton gin at work. But then look way in the background, especially over on the left and sort of in the middle there, you can see some burned out trees. There's one also to the right of the cotton gin. That shows you the damage that was done to the landscape and the scarred landscape that was persisting 20 years after the end of the war, where trees had been burned and you still have those remnants of dead trees. So the war is not really entirely over, culturally speaking. And then talk a little bit also about the landscape around some of these plantations. Lower right, that is a Currier and Ives image called A Home on the Mississippi. That also is actually a reconstruction image from 1871. What we have here is a riverfront home located in a grove. Remember, a grove of hardwood trees. We're going to come back to this idea of the grove. And notice we've got something dripping down from the branches. That is Spanish moss. So Spanish moss is actually a member of the pineapple family. It is not a true moss. And it's an epiphyte. It's not a parasite. It just simply grows hanging on the branches of a tree. It absorbs water from rain. It absorbs nutrients from rain. It just lives up there. And actually, during the Civil War, had a number of interesting uses. It was used to, by the military, grabbed handfuls of it and used it to stuff mattresses. At one point, the Confederacy, hard up for fibers, hard up for wool, and hard up for cotton after cotton production had ceased, they even tried to weave blankets out of Spanish moss. The ideal plantation landscape shows something like what you see in the top left there, the plantation house framed by an avenue of trees that meet across and make sort of a green dome, a little green bridge through which you travel. That plant, that tree is the southern live oak, and they are evergreen for most of the year. And so the southern live oak with the hanging Spanish moss, that is really sort of the quintessential southern ideal that many of these planters and owners were trying to achieve in laying out their plantation landscapes. And of course, many of them wanted groves of trees. So I said we'd come back to that idea of the grove. So what's going on with the idea of the grove? Trees at the time were thought to generate breezes, that somehow if you had trees, it would make the air move. It was thought that trees made the air healthier. People were concerned about malaria, and trees helped to uptake moisture from the soil and alleviate the swamping of soil, the swamping of land. The wives and daughters of plantation owners wanted attractive flowering shrubs, and they wanted them fast. They didn't want to wait. You know, once you had the money, and if you were nouveau riche, you wanted these plants to grow and to have them. And so this slide actually shows all members of one family. It's all the magnolia family. And top left is banana shrub. And actually, it has now been recently, like just in the last few months, it has been recently reclassified as a true magnolia. And as the name suggests, it does in fact smell like bananas. And so women and girls liked having this around, basically as a source of perfume. And they would cut the flowers and wear them. And it's a pretty fast growing tree, small tree. Top right is the southern magnolia. And that's the big white magnolia that we always think of associated with the South, with the big shiny evergreen leaves. Now, these are both American magnolias. They probably had a very wide distribution across North America prior to the Pleistocene. And they ended up in the South as a result of glaciation over much of the US, where a lot of northern plants got pushed down into, we think of them now as refugia. They got pushed down into the mountainous areas of the South where the glaciers did not reach, and that is where they persisted. But for instance, that southern magnolia, that can grow in Massachusetts. Um, and it can grow particularly along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. It does grow and it will survive. And so we think of these now as southern plants, but actually had a wider distribution. Uh, Bottom left, the lily flowered magnolia. Bottom right, the Yulan magnolia. And then they're a hybrid in the middle. So the one on the lower left is an American magnolia. The one on the lower right is an Asian magnolia. You get them together, they hybridize, and then you get that one in the middle, bottom middle there. And that one, the saucer magnolia, became extremely popular. It's Magnolia X Soulangeana. The X denotes that it is a hybrid, that it has two genetically different parents. So magnolias all over, and people love them, and it became a big part of the southern landscape, sort of the archetypal southern plants that were grown all over on these plantations, and they grow quickly, and you got pretty fast rewards for your efforts. And here are some other plants. There's not a single one of these that is native to the US, but we think of them all as quintessentially southern plants. And so you've got camellia, top left, from, as you can see, japonicus from Japan. Top right, you've got crepe myrtle. Look at its name. Indica is from India. You've got bottom left there, orange trees. Sinensis, that's from China. In the middle with the spotted leaves, Japanese Aucuba, japonica, that's from Japan. And then the only one where its name doesn't give it away is Pittosporum in the lower right. And that one I will tell you is from Japan. And so all of these are basically Asian plants, Japanese, Chinese, Indian plants, which has a similar latitude to the eastern part of the US. And all of these did extremely well in southern environments and grew and flourished and flowered really fast, really copiously, and rewarded the efforts of the people who planted them. And things go downhill from there. Some of the plants that were planted in American plantations have turned out to be some of the absolute worst invasive plants ever introduced to North America. And this shows you some of them. Top left, mimosa, member of the pea or bean family. It makes a lot of seeds. They all survive. It's a pain in the neck. It gets into forests. It kills native plants. Top right, Chinese parasol tree makes huge amounts of seeds again, and they get all over the place and they germinate, and there's just too many of them. Lower right, the Paulownia tree. This is a junk tree. It's highly prized in Asia. The Japanese think it's a prize of a tree, and they virtually worship this tree. They use it to make carved trinkets. Here in the US, it's a total mess. Back in the 80s, early 80s, there was a World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee. They worked for months to clear that World's Fair site of these Paulownia trees that were simply all over. And one of the ways they got spread is that the seeds are sort of soft and fuzzy on the outside, and the seeds were collected and they were used to pack china. So people would get shipments of dishes and then just toss the seeds outside, and every place a seed landed, you got another one of these Paulownia trees. Middle bottom there, that's the China berry tree. That's one that Harriet Beecher Stowe mentions in Uncle Tom's Cabin in a favorable light. The problem with China berry is that it's a mess. There is no time of the year that that tree is not dropping something. It's either dropping seeds or berries or flowers or leaves. And again, it is invasive. And then the most invasive, terrible one of all of these is the tree of heaven over on the lower left. If you know the novel A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, describes this basically trash tree that grows in all the abandoned sites and the railroad yards, and it has a bad smell, and that is the tree of heaven. It was considered initially attractive. It was grown in London at the Chelsea Physic Garden. It made its way to the US. It was here by the early 19th century. makes shade, but it emits a terrible smell, and it colonizes areas by sending out root suckers. So one tree can clone an acre or more of land. And so it was a considerable problem. Now, the gardens themselves that were around plantation houses were very much in a European style. So we're talking now about the first half of the 19th century. The thing that's ironic is that by this time, for instance, in England, and many of the planter class in the US considered themselves the social and functional equivalent of the landed gentry in England. The landed gentry in England at this point had abandoned these sorts of formal gardens with these formal edged beds and the geometric patterns and the parterres and all this. And they had gone in the direction of Capability Brown and the much less formal landscape garden. But here in the US, we were about 100 years behind. And the wives and daughters and the plantation owners wanted these sorts of very formal European style gardens to the extent that they hired itinerant Irish and English landscapers to come over and mark out these gardens and sort of square everything off and do these patterns. The style was called broidered, like the word embroidery, because you had these intricate patterns. And where the rubber meets the road, those patterns were actually defined by hedges. And so you had these geometric shapes, and inside of these geometric shapes, the parterres, if you will, you often would have a featured plant. And so it might be one of the flowering plants that we talked about, a camellia or a pittosporum, something like that. The problem here, from the viewpoint of uh, owners of plantations, the residents, was that they wanted fast results. And boxwood is a slow growing shrub. It takes a while to get a decent boxwood hedge going. And so many of them substituted in a little euonymus. And so if you look closely at some of these illustrations, they're not boxwood. They're actually the Japanese spindle tree, which was a little Japanese shrub, euonymus japonicus. But you got the same look. You got the same look. Now, these little hedges were hedges to be pretty, to define spaces in a garden. They were not really functional hedges. I want to talk a little bit, though, about functional hedges and fences. So, as you can imagine, if you had hundreds of acres, you would need some sort of fencing. And you can see some of the options here. Top left, a picket fence, very high maintenance. These needed to be continually monitored. Sections could fall down, the wood could rot. They had to be whitewashed to keep them looking half decent. Lower left, you have the split rail fence. These also could rot. They can be a little bit temperamental. They can collapse. A storm can make them collapse, this sort of thing. Many plantation owners went over to living hedges made out of the shrub or the small tree known as Osage orange. It's called Osage orange because, in fact, it has a greenish fruit that is resinous, and it's the size of a robust orange. You can see some of them there at the top. You're probably wondering, why does this woman have a picture of a mastodon, or maybe it's a woolly mammoth? Anyways, one of those big early elephant type animals. Why does she have this on the slide? Well, if we go back into the history of Osage orange, it has a history that predates the Pleistocene. And the fruit is so large, and it really defies chewing. So it was probably a fruit that was swallowed whole. The natural historian and ecologist Daniel Jansen, now retired from the University of Pennsylvania, has hypothesized that Osage orange is among a handful of still living plants where the fruit was actually swallowed whole by Pleistocene megafauna, so that a woolly mammoth or a mastodon would eat these things and swallow them whole. They're the only animals large enough to have a throat with a diameter to accommodate a fruit this size. That's all peripheral. The seeds germinate pretty consistently to make a hedge, or what actually most people started doing was they just started taking cuttings And the cuttings actually rooted right in a lot of southern soil. You didn't even have to really root them. You could just stick them in the ground and the thing would root. And the branches lower right there, inset, are very thorny. This was the living equivalent of barbed wire. Barbed wire hadn't been invented yet, but you get a nice, thick, dense hedge of Osage orange. And some of these hedges still exist. They've been cut down. I've got pictures there of a couple that are sort of sprouting up again. But this was a living hedge that was sort of the equivalent of something as tough and formidable to animals and humans as barbed wire. And there were at least two battles in which Union troops took advantage of Osage orange hedges and hid behind them and were able to fire successfully at Confederate troops using the Osage orange basically as a shelter. And now let's take a peek inside the plantation houses, see what's going on in there. Of course, the style in most of them was a Rococo revival style. These people were maximalists. They liked high style. They liked carvings. They liked decoration. This was a style that began in England, gained popularity in France, and then was adopted by U.S. furniture makers who catered to customers with social aspirations and the money to pursue social aspirations. So this furniture that you can see in this room has these curvilinear shapes, a lot of intricate carvings and piercings. And the best of this style of Rococo revival furniture came from the workshops of John Henry Belter. So Belter was actually a German immigrant who set up shop as a cabinet maker in New York City. And he sold primarily to a Southern clientele. His parlor furniture, which you see here, was considered the most desirable. And before the Civil War, large quantities were shipped to Confederate states, and some of it was shipped by Union soldiers back north during the war, after the war, from plantation houses that they raided. So some of it made its way back north. So the features of Belter furniture. Well, obviously, a lot of carving, and it was deep carving. And to accomplish that deep carving without having the wood split, he developed and patented a method for basically making a prototype of modern plywood. So the outermost wood that he used was rosewood from South America. Very pretty, big, beautiful grain, black and reddish brown grain. And between the outer layers of rosebud, he had 5 additional layers of wood. So there were 7 layers of wood altogether. Rosewood, 5 more hardwoods, and then rosewood on the outside. And they were arranged with the grain of the wood running at right angles. So it was really a plywood. And then they were cemented together and clamped and then steamed into these curvilinear shapes and then carved. And that's how all of this was accomplished. The woods on the inside were hickory, black walnut, or oak. So these were strong pieces of furniture. And the carvings were basically botanical in nature. They were inspired by pattern books that had been imported from England. And we see a lot of carvings of roses, grapes, morning glories, pomegranates, oak leaves, acorns. And all of this reflected prosperity. And there were some plantation houses that had 70 or more pieces of this Belter furniture. There was a great interest in houseplants during the first half of the 19th century. There were many books and pamphlets about raising plants indoors. A lot of interest in plants with little curiosities, like the top left there. That was known as the slipper plant. It's Calceolaria. There were all kinds of hybrids of Calceolaria. That particular one looks like the sections of a tangerine. And people loved it. They just thought it was so darn cute. And then primroses and all their different colors in the lower left. And lower right, that's a parlor maple. It's not a true maple. It's actually a relative of cotton. Top right, fuchsia. During the Civil War itself, women became completely obsessed with houseplants. And this has really been interpreted as a metaphor for family life and maternal devotion. That during a time when tensions were high and sons and fathers and brothers and uncles were gone, lavishing attention on plants became an extremely popular pastime for a lot of women. And that included the pursuit of, again, something that started in England. And this was pteridomania, a mania for ferns. In the middle there on the top, you can see a so-called Wardian case. Now, these were actually developed for botanists to use who were bringing collections in from tropical areas, hoping that the plants would survive, basically, if they were transported in a large terrarium, so they wouldn't get chilled or dried. But then these Wardian cases were adapted for home use. And ferns did pretty well inside unheated, dark houses. So a lot of these houses had heavy drapes. They did not have central heating. They were very cool, especially in the winter months. And some people used these various terrariums. The one in the lower middle actually had a heater. You could, well, it was actually a little gas burners under it that you could light, and it would keep the collections inside warm. And there were numerous books published on the raising, collecting and raising and rearing and propagating of ferns, pitched at a female audience. Women spent time out collecting. This was a fad in England, and it became a fad in the US, especially in the South during the Civil War. And one of the most peculiar things that I discovered, the idea of taking leaves and flowers from plants, soaking them in a chlorite solution, which removed any living tissue, left behind just the veins, just the vascular tissue, and bleached it white, and then arranging them under a three-dimensional dome. This method was developed by Edward Parrish. He was actually the president of Swarthmore College, and he published a little book in 1863 called The Phantom Bouquet, about the craft of skeletonizing plants. And again, I take this as a metaphor for death. Preserving something that once was living, it has a ghostly appearance, definitely a phantom ghostly appearance. And this became a hobby that many women who were home waiting for their men to return, if they did return, took this up as a pastime. And what actually happened at these plantations when war came? So if we go back to the French Middle Ages, they talked about the chevauché raids. And this was one of the strategies of warfare in medieval Europe. And the idea was essentially that you destroy the home front and you leave the civilian population in a defenseless way. And so Union troops were instructed when they reached a plantation to go into the fields and destroy the fences, to burn anything that was combustible. Hence the burning of the trees, the remnants of the trees we saw in that Currier and Ives image, to destroy crops, harvest anything and take it with you if it's potentially useful. Go into the larders, go into the pantries, go into the cellars, the root cellars, and take, steal, destroy provisions. And then, I think most curiously, to go after textiles, go after bedding, and go after clothing. And this effectively destroyed home life, and it became very difficult, if not impossible, for people left at home at these plantations to replace these things because there was no industry. Farming had been disrupted. In many cases, the slaves had been freed and left. And so they were left in sort of the burned out remnants of what had been virtually a small village unto itself. And that's what was left. And a big problem was if you were still living in one of these plantation houses, how did you have light at night? And so there was at this point probably no oil available for you to use in your lamps, no gas, no gas lights or anything like that, no oil lamps. And so, in an act of desperation, what many people started doing was just finding what they called candlewood. Candlewood is basically wood that burns very brightly, in particular pine, and in particularly pine knots. And so they would knock the knots out of pine, bring them inside, put them on the hearth, put them on the table, and burn them. And they'd cast a bright light. They take the place of a candle, they take the place of an oil lamp. The problem is, yes, the resin, you see some of it dripping there in the lower left, is highly flammable. It burns brightly, but it also makes a mess. It is very sooty. So just think about some of that belt or furniture covered with soot. Think about some of those beautiful walls and the damask wallpaper and the ornate ceilings with the plasterwork covered in soot, because that's what it was like by the end of the war. And of course, there were severe food shortages, and there were food riots in some of the southern cities, primarily women who could not feed their families. Their provisions had been destroyed, farming was disrupted, and they were out of gas. They had no more food. And what was going to happen? And so that was certainly another factor. And now we'll segue into medicine. Oh, sorry. Ooh, sorry. Okay, medicine. Um, there was not a single practice of medicine in America in the middle of the 19th century. You had some doctors that were heroic practitioners who believed in purging and bleeding and leeches and strong laxatives and emetics, on the theory that there's something wrong with you, we'll get it out of you one way or another, we'll bleed it out, or one way or the other, one end or the other. You had Thompsonian practitioners who believed in a lot of herbal treatments. And then you had the eclectic practices in which those physicians used a mixture. They might still be doing some bleeding, but they also were using some herbal medicines. It was an era of an enormous number of patent and proprietary medicines and bitters. So a patent medicine is typically a proprietary medicine. In other words, it's made by somebody who owns the recipe and doesn't share the ingredients, and the bottle shape itself is patented. That's where the idea of patent comes from. And so what were people actually taking? In many cases, they didn't know. There might have been ingredients advertised on the bottle that were not there or that were there. We don't really know, or they were incorrectly identified. And then bitters really began as an herbal medicine, maybe some sort of a proprietary mixture, but then moved in the direction of having a very high alcohol content. So we'll come back to that. And then at the time of the Civil War, the idea of the germ theory of disease was not understood. Sterile practice was unknown, and many people believed that disease was caused by miasma, particularly malaria. Miasma is basically bad smells in the air, often associated with swamps. And I think it was probably really methane, the odor of decomposing cellulose from plants that they were smelling, but that was what they blamed for disease. So in the South, as a result of embargoes, as a result of embargoes in the South, there were drastic shortages. And Francis Pear Porcher, who was both a botanist and a medical doctor, ended up compiling a book, Resources of Southern Fields and Forests. Came out in 1863. He used every possible source of information he could get his hands on: medical texts, articles, travelers' tales, hearsay, folk wisdom, whatever he could compile, he put into this book, so that if you couldn't get a particular drug, you could look in this book and look at possible substitutes that Porcher recommended. And so it's you can find a copy of this online. Makes very, very interesting reading. And he advocated some things that were totally nonsensical, and other things actually have turned out to be correct. And I'll point a couple of those out to you. Uh, Coming back to the idea of miasma theory and malaria, I don't know, this is jumping ahead here. You can see some of the illustrations here, miasma coming out almost as a ghostly presence from the water. And they didn't realize that the actual cause of malaria was a bite from the female Anopheles mosquito in her salivary glands. She had living down there, the extreme lower right, that little blue creature there. That is the organism that causes malaria. It's called a plasmodium. It's not unlike the little amoeba that you may have looked at in high school biology at some point. It lives in her salivary glands. She bites you. That little guy gets in your bloodstream. It invades a red blood cell, lives in there. That blood cell bursts. A bunch of more of these little things come out. They invade other blood cells, and this is the cause of malaria. It's not a bacteria. It's not a virus. It is actually a little paramecium-like or amoeba-like organism. And they didn't understand this, and they didn't understand the connection to swamps. They thought it was the odor coming from the swamps. They didn't realize that it was actually an insect that was breeding in the swamps. So I'm sure you've heard, and you probably know more about it than I do, that many more soldiers died from disease during the Civil War, particularly malaria, than from battle wounds. And some of the encampments consisted of literally hundreds of men in various stages of malaria. Now, in the Northeast, there was a little mind of its own tonight. In the Northeast, the Union Army had the Sanitary Commission, and the head of the Sanitary Commission was Frederick Law Olmsted, who had actually made a series of trips to the South before the war. He knew the lay of the land. He actually was a landscape architect of all things. He wasn't a military man, but he understood the importance of siting Union military encampments as far from swamps as possible. And so the Union troops had Olmsted and Olmsted's wisdom of keeping them away from the swamps where the malarial organisms were breeding in the Anopheles mosquitoes. And they had sanitary fairs, money was being raised for them, and perhaps most importantly, they had a source of quinine. In the South, they didn't have the quinine, and we'll talk more about what they used instead. And much of the agriculture, as we said, was occurring in these swampy, flooded fields. And so I had mentioned that as many as 40% of the slaves in the South could be immune to malaria. If you look at the map of Africa there, the area of Western Africa, which is a deep blue color, shows you where you have a high incidence of the gene for sickle cell anemia. So some slaves actually had sickle cell anemia because they had two genes, and they probably did not survive because there were no medications for it back then. But if you had just one gene for sickle cell anemia, you were immune to malaria. And here's what would happen. You see normal red blood cells there on the lower left. If one of those little plasmodium creatures got into the blood cell, it would quickly become an odd shape. And you can see how a few of those cells have an odd pointed sickle shape. And that cell then would right away be attacked by a white blood cell. So anybody who had one gene for sickle cell anemia was immune to malaria. And those people tended to survive in Africa, in the high malarial areas of Africa. And so if that's where the slaves came from, as many as 40% of the people being brought in who were working in these fields were in fact immune to malaria. And so nobody understood exactly what was going on at the time, but that is how it worked. And so planters and their wives and their children would try to get away from the swamps in the summertime, and they would leave the slaves behind because it was known that many of them were malarially resistant. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the Union troops had plenty of quinine. Quinine was actually first known in South America, It was known to the Aztecs. It was discovered by early Jesuit priests. 16th century Jesuit priests heard about it. It comes from a member of the coffee family. You can see what the plant looks like down there. It is actually isolated. The quinine is actually isolated from the bark of the plant, and it was known as fever bark because it prevented the fevers of malaria. The Union Army had very decent supplies of quinine. It was used medicinally for a number of different diseases, not just malaria. The embargo against the Confederacy prevented quinine from getting into the South. It's extremely bitter stuff, and soldiers had to be forced to take it. They would usually line them up and make them drink their draft of quinine every day, but the majority of Union soldiers did not get malaria. Porcher recommended investigating these three plants as alternatives to quinine: dogwood, tulip poplar, and black willow. So dogwood is dogwood, and it's all over the South. It's an understory tree in the forests. Tulip poplar is a member of, actually is a member of the magnolia family, and black willow. And they tried all of these together individually. We now know actually that dogwood poached in water does seem to have some activity against malaria. The theory at the time was, well, we'll just try other bark, right? You know, you've got the quinine bark. Well, if that doesn't work, we don't have it, we'll just try other barks. And so the idea was we'll get the dogwood bark, the tulip poplar bark, the blackwood, and the dogwood bark may actually have been somewhat effective. But here is the most effective of all of them. So quinine came from a member of the coffee family. And that's the family Rubiaceae. You can see in the lower left there. It's the fifth largest family of flowering plants. And another member of the Rubiaceae is Georgia bark, Pinknea. You can see on the map, it has just a narrow little range in Florida and Georgia. And it's a pretty rare plant. And it is as good as quinine, as the quinine producing fever bark in curing malaria. And drug suppliers in the South advertised for it. So there's a little notice that's from the newspaper in Atlanta, and I'll read it to you. It says they're looking for bark of the dogwood, bark of the willow, bark of the poplar, and bark of Pinknea pubens. And he'll pay you 40 cents per pound for any of those barks, and bring it over to Savannah or Macon, Georgia. And I'll tell you, the irony is that by the time World War II rolled around, what, 80 years later, we had completely forgotten about this plant. And we had huge quinine shortages. Why? Because even though the quinine producing tree, fever bark, is from South America, the US did not have plantations of fever bark as a source of quinine growing anywhere in the continental US or in South America. It was growing on a pharmaceutical scale only on islands in Indonesia, Java, that eventually were controlled by the Japanese. And nobody in Washington could read the tea leaves and see that this was happening. And worse yet, any knowledge of the history of Georgia bark and its efficacy in fighting malaria had been completely forgotten. And ideally, going into World War II, someone would have started growing Georgia bark in the South and had big plantations of this stuff, so that when the Japanese took over the Indonesian islands, we just could turn to this. Our quinine shortages in the South were dreadful, and men ended up having to take atabrine, which is a coal tar derivative that turns you yellow and has a number of other unpleasant side effects because we did not have quinine. I'll get off my soapbox now. Let's see, 2 words about poppy. If anyone ever asks you what is the single most important plant in warfare, I think I'd have to say the opium poppy, because it's the source of the best known opiate pain relievers. Of course, opium was in a lot of patent medicines in the 19th century. You had these soothing syrups, top left, that were used to, silence and make teething and cranky babies were given a dose of this stuff. And you could buy the full syringe setup, hypodermic setup from Sears and Roebuck, and morphine was easily available. A lot of morphine was used to treat people who had lost limbs during the war. And opium addiction, morphine addiction, became known as the soldier's disease. And then all of the promises made by different um, hospitals and sanitariums that we could cure the disease. The fact is that many people in the 19th century simply lived their lives as opium or morphine addicts, but did not turn to crime because these chemicals were available and you could still live your life pretty well. But in terms of an important plant in war, the most important plant in wartime, I think I would have to say it would be the opium poppy. And where did the opium poppies come from? Well, some were grown especially as wartime crops. Some people were growing in old herb gardens that they had kept going. Some people were growing them as decorative plants. And then anytime you have a homestead, you might still find opium producing poppies around the outside of the homestead that had escaped and naturalized from older gardens. And so there was plenty of opium available. Bitters, mention those briefly. They're basically an excuse for drinking alcohol. Many of them started as they really started as herbal medicines, but then many of them during the Civil War were marketed especially to soldiers, and they, in many cases, contain plants that have absolutely no known medicinal use. I guess my favorite there is the fly trap bitters. Fly traps are insect-eating, insect-trapping plants. You can see what they look like in the top right. I don't think they have any medicinal use whatsoever. But somebody was selling fly trap bitters. Of course, these would be, 90+% alcohol and, a trace amount of herbs. But a lot of soldiers self-medicated with these. And there were all sorts of proprietary pills and ointments that honestly, we don't really know exactly what was in them. And they probably didn't do any good, but maybe they had a placebo effect for some men. I want to talk a little bit about bandages. So some of the cotton that was grown went to make bandages, and also some of the linen went to make bandages. If you read in the literature, you'll see this word Sharpie, CHRPIE, which actually refers to two types of a surgical preparation. In some cases, and this was done by women and children working at home, they called them lint societies that would meet basically around somebody's table and take a knife, a sharp tool of some sort, and scrape the lint from the cotton and make little piles of it. And this would be used to pack a wound. Or alternately, they would take cloth and pull out some of the warp and woof thread so that it became more like a piece of gauze rather than densely woven cloth. And this was used for bandaging as well. And so either just the loose fibers or the more gauze-like, both were called a Sharpie. And some of it is a little bit gruesome from Walt Whitman. From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough, etc. Basically, it gave a place for blood to clot on in the wounds. And of course, none of this was sterile. No germ theory of disease at this point. So the Civil War saw more amputations than any other war in history, around 60,000. The cause of this was gas gangrene. So gas gangrene is caused by a relative of the same anaerobic oxygen avoiding bacteria that causes food poisoning, that makes jars explode. And it has to live in an oxygen-free environment. So if you had a deep wound, gas gangrene could grow in there. This was before the era of any sort of pharmaceutical antibiotic. And so if an arm or a leg was shattered by a bullet and the bone was shattered and you had a deep wound and soil and fibers got in there, the typical solution was simply to remove it, which led to a tremendous demand for prosthetic limbs. Between 1861 and 1873, there were 133 different patents for different varieties of prosthetic limbs, all of which were made from plant materials. And the woods that were involved, the earliest ones were made of oak, typically just using staves from barrels, just the sections of a barrel could be used to make an artificial leg. But then moving on, willow was a nice lightweight wood. Black gum was favored because black gum has the grain in black gum is somewhat twisted. And so black gum doesn't tend to shatter. Basswood was used. Walnut was used. It's high, it will tolerate high impact. So often the heels of legs were made from walnut. And then these various limbs were finished in many cases with a layer of paper mache, again, plant material, painted with pigments involving plants to make them as lifelike as possible. And some of the more sophisticated patents had various rubber cores, again, rubber, a plant material, so that the legs, the joints could move, the arms and legs could actually move. So now I want to say a little tiny bit about slave medicine. So I mentioned before that slaves were a big commodity. They were basically another crop. If you could convince your slaves to have children, those children could be enslaved, and sold as slaves. So many planters and overseers tried to encourage men and women who were enslaved to marry and tried to provide them with the best possible housing that they could afford for them, floors and fireplaces and cooking equipment, garden spaces, beds, bedsteads, mattresses, linens. And many of them could not figure out why more children were not born. Because if you figure that a young woman might marry at age 15 and continue potentially to have children until she's, say, 45, so that's a good 30 years, right? You might be able to expect a baby every other year, so maybe 15 children, reasonably, a few more, a few less. And the vast majority of slaves never had 15 children. They might have some, but not 15. So it turns out that many enslaved women were in fact practicing birth control, botanical birth control. And what did that look like? So let's see. The yellow flowering plant in the lower left is a plant called asafoetida. It was brought with them from Africa. It's a member of the carrot family, the Queen Anne's lace family. It's a relative of a now extinct plant called silphium that ancient Greek and Roman women used for birth control. And that plant, we know, we suspect, produced compounds that blocked the synthesis of progesterone, which is the hormone you need to sustain a healthy pregnancy. The compound in asafoetida that seems to do this is ferragel. You can see what it looks like there in the lower left. Asafoetida also had a number of other medicinal uses. Some women would take it and tie little bags of asafoetida around their children's necks to ward off disease. It was used for stomach problems, all sorts of, it was a folk medicine with wide uses, but it seems to have been a type of birth control, chewing fetida. Tree cotton. Tree cotton is an African cotton, which is a relative of the South American cotton that was being grown on plantations. In its roots, it makes a compound called gossypol. And gossypol seems to cause birth defects in young fetuses. And so enslaved women would dig up the roots of the cotton they were cultivating on plantations and chew those roots, and it seems to have the same effect. So they might conceive, but the fetus didn't live. And then the third one that we know was used was black haw. It's a viburnum. I don't know if this worked. I don't have any chemical evidence that this worked. And enslaved women, this is an American plant, and enslaved women learned about this from Native American women. And it may not have been effective, or maybe it was. I cannot explain it medically. But the asafoetida and the tree cotton definitely were effective oral contraceptives that slave women used. And now, let's see, we're going to segue into a little discussion of landscape and military engineering pretty quickly. Of course, all the military engineering involved plant materials. The corduroy roads were layers of boards, and the various pontoon bridges that were designed were made of wood. In many cases, just whatever wood was available at a given site. Landscape was often surveilled using, especially in the first 2 years of the war, using tethered balloons. Both the North and the South did this. And these balloons, which allowed them, they'd send up a couple of men in the basket of the balloon to look over the land, to see what the other side was doing. And these balloons were made of silk. There was a huge demand for silk during the Civil War, not only for balloons, but also for sashes and medals and all this sort of thing. I consider silk a botanical product. It's because the silkworms have to live on mulberry, and then they spin out these silk fibers, and this is what is actually woven to make the silk cloth. You will hear, particularly if you visit some of these, Southern house museums, that women took their dresses off and gave their silk dresses to the Confederacy so that they could take the fabric from their dresses and make balloons out of it. I don't think that's true. It may well be that some yard goods, that some yardage still on the bolt was used, but I don't think any women's actual dresses were being cut apart. But there were some Confederate balloons that had patterns or plaids on them aloft. And then the silk was covered with pine resin dissolved basically in turpentine. We don't have the exact recipe, but that's what it was. Not unlike what they called the dope that was used to cover the cloth wings of certain wooden aircraft as late as World War II. So some more of the military engineering that was 100% dependent on plant materials. These are the pontoon bridges. The pontoon bridges were wood, wood going left and right and wood going up and down. Of course, there's vast specialized terminology for all this, which we're not going to use. And then there were floats. There were the bateaux, the lightweight boats under them, or in some cases they used basically big air-filled rubber bladders, basically air-filled balloons to keep the pontoon bridges across. And a pontoon bridge can go across a wide waterway. But what the armies quickly learned was that you could not have the soldiers march on a Civil War era pontoon bridge in unison because it would sink the bridge. And so when they got to the bridge, the order was stop marching, walk. And then when they got to the other side, they could resume marching safely once again. There was a lot of lashing that occurred to lash the whole thing together, and these were dragged, the troops dragged these along and then set them up when they needed to cross bodies of water, primarily rivers. And then these are some close-ups of some of the corduroy roads, and some of these are still found today, depending upon the wood that was used. For instance, if bald cypress was involved with it, they probably haven't rotted. And so in some places in the South, lower right, you can see they're excavating for a road, and what do they find but a Civil War era remnants of a corduroy road. And in some cases, it took several layers of corduroy to get up high enough off the ground to keep the troops and the animals out of the mud. And then we have all of this complex language associated with siege warfare. If you've read about this, you've seen the terms gabions, fascines, sap rollers, hurdles. Most of these were substructures made of plant material. Most of them were nothing more than glorified baskets where spikes were put in the ground and then whatever available plant material, including, remember we talked about the cane brakes? A lot of that cane, sort of like bamboo, was woven to make a lot of these. Then once these were made, and they had to be made to very precise sizes and diameters and heights, they were lined up, filled with soil, filled with rocks, and tiers were developed. And this is how many of these fortifications were actually made, starting with this substructure that was made of plant materials. And I'm sort of glossing over a lot of this. Lower level there, second image from the left, those are the fascines. They're basically bundles of twigs and wood, whatever you can get, lashed together. And when you got to a place where there was a big dip or some sort of a pit, you dump those in and it would allow you to go over it a little bit more smoothly rather than going way down in a hollow. It was basically brushwood. But notice how precise it all is, everything to precise measurements. So, and these are the last couple of slides here. What has been the long-term effect of the war on the landscape in the South? Well, all of the bullets that landed have deposited a lot of lead into the soil. And in areas where there were battles, this lead is continuing to oxidize in the soil. It turns out that the oxidized lead inhibits the growth of bacteria. And so you don't get the amount of breakdown of organic material in the soil. So a lot of the soil is sort of nutrient poor because things are not breaking down and composting naturally and recycling naturally because of the high lead content of the soil. And so this artillery, I guess, keeps on giving. And a lot of the bullets ended up lower right there, embedded in trees. And so as these trees come down, if they decompose, more lead is being continually added to the soil. And we don't necessarily see those bullets because in many cases the tree has grown over them, has developed callus tissue over the bullets. But this is a war that ecologically speaking lives on and actually inhibits the growth of a lot of plants in the South, and many of the tree little seedlings that you see are just simply not growing as quickly, especially in areas where there were a significant number of Civil War battles. So that is my talk. And if anybody has a question or a complaint, I'll try to answer it. And oh yeah, these are the two books. They're both published by McFarland. McFarland has a big Civil War list, and I recommend them highly as a publisher. One thing that appealed to me about McFarland, I'll do a little McFarland plug here. One thing that appealed to me about McFarland is that they actually publish the books in the United States. They have their own paper mills. They have their own forests. They make their own paper. They have their own publishers. And everything is printed here stateside rather than in Asia. That sort of appealed to me as a writer. Okay, questions?
Judith, that was absolutely fantastic. What a presentation you had for us this evening. So much information, far more than I thought we would even be getting. So thank you very much for that. Real quick, Rachel, do we have any questions that came in on the live stream? If not, I just have a couple in regards, but I know we're getting late, so we'll wrap it up unless there's any from the public at large.
No, I don't see any
Great.
I hope I
online
haven't put
now.
everybody to sleep. I apologize.
No, we've got a good amount of people watching,
No,
actually,
not
so
at
that's
all.
great. I did have a quick question about military engineering and more specifically the repercussions of the war on the environment, because you touched on that on your very last slide, actually, interestingly enough. We do see a lot of the soil contamination through lead was fascinating, and I had never thought about that, but I've heard of just devastating effects of the southern logging industry, post-Civil War, Reconstruction era, and beyond, especially after the chainsaw becomes popular, and just how dangerous it could be to log these former battlefields because of the amount of lead and shrapnel that was in some of the
Absolutely. Yeah.
trees.
Yeah.
Have you run across that in your own research?
Not specifically in the South, but the same thing in Europe
Oh, yes, I could
as a
see that.
result of World War II. And yes, there have been a number of extremely unfortunate incidents, especially in Germany, where there have been shells embedded in wood. People have brought a log into their fireplace, begun burning it, and the shell has exploded inside their house.
Oh
Yes,
my.
yes. And I know that loggers now are extremely sensitive to that.
Mhm.
They are here in the Northeast. Actually, it was during the pandemic. We had in the front of our house, we have two ancient oak trees. They're each about we used to have two ancient oak trees,
Hmm.
about 300 years old. One of them fell and crushed my house uh, and made a mess. And when we had the remnants of that tree taken down, because we had to, we asked the loggers, don't you want the wood? And they said, no, no logging operation will take it because they are afraid that there will be metal in it.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't have a lot of artillery shooting around over here, but they're just afraid that there could be just something embedded in the wood. Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, Judith, thank you very much once again for joining us this evening. It was a wonderful presentation, just an absolute ton of information. I'm probably going to be picking up Plants of the Civil War at the very least, just for the amount of history that's there and for the work that I do. I hope everyone enjoyed our live stream this evening. This presentation will be going up on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's YouTube channel here in the next few days, week or so. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday, and we look forward to seeing everyone in the new year next month for our January meeting. We'll be back in the museum third Thursday, 7 p.m. We look forward to seeing you all there. So again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great holidays, and we will talk to you all soon.